I still remember the exact weight of that piece of paper in my hand. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, the kind of night where the air carries just enough chill to remind you that warmth is something you have to earn. I was hanging Claire's coat by the front door, one of those small, automatic gestures you perform after 9 years of marriage without thinking, when something slipped from the inside pocket and floated to the floor. A hotel receipt. The Grand Meridian. Room 412. 2 nights ago. Charged to a card I didn't recognize. I stood there for a long moment, the paper between my fingers, the sounds of the house moving around me like nothing had changed. Sophie's cartoon was playing in the living room. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed slowly through the wet street. I folded the receipt and put it in my own pocket. I didn't say anything. Not that night. My name is Daniel. I'm 38 years old, a structural engineer who spends his days calculating load tolerances and stress points in buildings, figuring out exactly how much pressure a structure can absorb before something gives way. The irony of that isn't lost on me now. I was trained to find invisible fractures. I just never thought to look for them at home. Claire and I met 11 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday party. She was laughing at something across the room when I first saw her. Genuinely laughing, the kind that doesn't perform itself. I spent the rest of that evening trying to make her laugh again. It took me 20 minutes and a terrible joke about architecture, but it worked. We were inseparable within a month. We married 2 years later. Bought a house in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and a backyard Sophie could grow up in. For a long time, the life we built together felt solid, intentional, real. Claire worked part-time at a small art gallery downtown, a job she loved more for the environment than the income. She knew every artist on the walls by name, by story, by the particular grief or obsession that had pushed them to create. That sensitivity was one of the things I had always admired about her. She paid attention to people in a way I sometimes struggled to. Sophie arrived 7 years into our relationship and rewrote everything. Not badly, just completely. The sleep deprivation, the new rhythms, the way your identity quietly reorganizes itself around a small person who needs you entirely. Claire and I navigated it the way most couples do, with love, with exhaustion, with the gradual, almost imperceptible drift that neither of us named out loud. Looking back now, I think the drift began long before I noticed it. I told myself we were simply settling into a comfortable phase, that this was what a stable marriage looked like from the inside. I was wrong about that. The changes started about 3 months before that hotel receipt fell into my hand. Small things at first. Claire began going out more, yoga classes on Tuesday evenings, gallery openings on Thursdays, occasional Saturday nights described as girls' dinners with Linda. I didn't question any of it. She had always maintained her own social life, and I respected that. I told myself it was healthy, but something in the texture of those evenings had shifted. She came home later than expected and offered explanations before I asked for them. She started wearing a new perfume, something darker, more expensive than her usual, on nights she went out. Her phone, which had always lived face up on the kitchen counter, began spending its time face down on every surface in the house. I noticed, and I filed it away under things I wasn't ready to examine. Then came Sophie. It was a Sunday morning about 6 weeks before the receipt. I was making breakfast and Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table drawing. She was in a horse phase, every page covered in galloping creatures with wild manes. Claire was still upstairs getting ready for another gallery event. "Daddy," Sophie said without looking up from her drawing. "Who is the tall man Mommy talks to at the club?" I turned from the stove slowly. "What tall man, sweetheart?" She shrugged with the magnificent indifference of a 7-year-old. "The one with the nice car." Mommy smiled a lot. I remember how something shifted inside me in that moment. A sensation I couldn't name yet, somewhere between my stomach and my chest. I kept my voice even. "When did you see Mommy at the club?" But Sophie had already moved on, adding a new horse to the page, the question evaporating from her mind as quickly as it had surfaced. I didn't ask Claire about it. I told myself Sophie had probably misremembered something, mixed up a timeline, invented a detail the way children sometimes do. I was very thorough in constructing that explanation. I didn't ask because I was afraid of the answer. The receipt changed something. Not loudly. There was no dramatic moment of realization. No shattering of the world as I knew it. It was quieter than that. More like the sound a hairline fracture makes before the wall comes down. I went through the motions of that evening with mechanical precision. Finished making dinner, helped Sophie with her bath, read her 2 chapters of her book until she fell asleep with her hand curled under her cheek. Claire came home at 10:15. She smelled of wine and that perfume again. She kissed me on the cheek and said the event had run long. I said that was fine. We watched television for an hour without really watching it, and then we went to bed, and I lay in the dark next to my wife of 9 years with a hotel receipt in the pocket of my jeans on the floor and thought about stress points. About how much pressure a structure can absorb. About the exact moment something stops bending and starts to break. Our mornings had a choreography to them. I was always first up, 6:15, no alarm needed, a habit built from years of early site visits. Coffee first, then the quiet 20 minutes before the house woke up that I had come to think of as mine alone. Sophie appeared next, always with her hair tangled and her eyes still soft with sleep, dragging whatever stuffed animal had shared her bed that night. Claire followed last, moving through the kitchen with the fluid efficiency of someone who had learned to be a morning person through necessity rather than nature. For 9 years that sequence had felt like a kind of music, ordinary and sustaining. In the weeks after I found the receipt, I started paying attention to it differently. I watched Claire pour her coffee and check her phone before she said good morning to anyone. I noticed how she angled the screen away from the counter, a small adjustment probably unconscious, but there. I watched her laugh at something she read and then set the phone face down again before I could see her expression settle back into the neutral geography of a Tuesday morning. I said nothing. I observed. Ryan had been my closest friend since our 2nd year of university, the kind of friendship that survives distance and silence and the general erosion that adult life performs on connection. He worked at the same engineering firm 2 floors up, which meant we had lunch together 2 or 3 times a week in a way that felt less like scheduling and more like breathing. It was Ryan who first said out loud what I had been refusing to think. We were eating sandwiches on a bench outside the office, 3 days after the receipt. I hadn't told him anything yet. I was still in the stage where saying it out loud would make it real. "You look like a man doing math he doesn't want to finish," Ryan said. I looked at him. He had known me long enough to read the specific silence I was producing. I told him about the receipt, about Sophie's question, about the perfume and the phone and the explanations offered before questions were asked. Ryan didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "How long has this been building?" That was the question that stayed with me. Not whether it was true, not what I should do, but how long. I thought about it seriously for the first time sitting on that bench. And the honest answer unsettled me. Because when I actually traced it back, stripped away the comfortable explanations I had been constructing for months, the signs had been there longer than I wanted to admit. Claire's relationship with her phone had changed incrementally over the course of the summer. First, it was simply face down more often. Then came the new passcode. She had always used Sophie's birthday, a code I knew without thinking about it. And one day in August it simply stopped working when I accidentally picked up her phone to check the time. I noticed but said nothing. People changed passcodes. It meant nothing. Then there were the messages she stepped out of rooms to answer. Not always, not dramatically, but often enough that a pattern assembled itself quietly in the background of our shared life. A buzz, a glance, a small shift in her posture, and then, "I'll just be a second," as she moved toward the hallway. I told myself she was dealing with something at the gallery, a difficult client, a scheduling problem. I was generous with my explanations. What I understand now is that denial isn't passive, it's an active construction. You build it piece by piece, using the materials of trust and habit and the simple human terror of what might be waiting on the other side of certainty. The gallery events had multiplied. Claire had always attended openings. It was part of her job, part of the life she had built around art and the people who made it. But where before there had been perhaps one event every few weeks, now there were 2 or 3, sometimes on consecutive nights. Thursday openings became Friday late nights, became occasional Saturdays that stretched past midnight. I went with her to one of them in mid-September. A photographer's show, large black and white prints of industrial landscapes that Claire talked about with genuine passion on the drive over. The gallery was warm and crowded, full of the particular social energy of people performing their appreciation of things. I watched Claire work the room. She was good at it, at the light touch of connection, the remembered detail, the way she could make someone feel like the most interesting person present. I had always admired this about her. That evening, I noticed a man watching her from across the room. Tall, well-dressed, somewhere in his mid-40s, with the particular ease of someone accustomed to being the most financially comfortable person in any space he entered. He didn't approach her that night, but his attention was deliberate in a way that lodged itself in my memory. I didn't connect it to anything. Not yet. I poured myself another glass of wine and told myself I was being paranoid. Sophie asked about the tall man one more time. It was a Thursday evening, 2 weeks after the first mention, while I was helping her with a school project. A poster about animals that lived in the ocean. She was cutting out a photograph of a blue whale with the focused seriousness that children bring to scissors. "Daddy, does Mommy's friend have a boat?" I kept my voice level. "Which friend?" "The tall one. He said something about a boat." I heard when Mommy was on the phone. I looked at my daughter's face, entirely unconcerned, entirely absorbed in the whale, and felt the structure of something shift beneath me. Not collapse, just move the way a building moves in wind, testing its own tolerances. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said. That was the first time I truly started to doubt in a way I couldn't argue myself out of. The receipt could be explained. The phone behavior could be rationalized. But Sophie had now mentioned this man twice with specific details: the club, the car, a boat, and children don't invent those kinds of specifics. They report what they observe. I started paying a different kind of attention after that. I am by nature a methodical person. It comes with the work. You learn to separate what you know from what you assume, to require evidence before conclusion, to resist the narrative that emotion wants to construct. I had always thought of this as a professional strength. In those weeks of growing suspicion, it became something more complicated, both a discipline and a cage. I didn't confront Claire. I watched. Her schedule had developed a new geography that I began mapping without fully acknowledging what I was doing. Tuesday evenings she was reliably out from 7 until 10 or 11, yoga, she said, though I had noticed she never came home with the particular physical looseness that follows a real practice. Thursdays were gallery events, running long with increasing frequency. And then there were the unscheduled absences, a Saturday afternoon errand that took 3 hours, a Sunday morning coffee with Linda that extended through lunch. I began noting times without writing them down, carrying them in the back of my mind like a calculation I wasn't ready to complete. The man from the gallery returned to my thoughts. I hadn't learned his name that evening, hadn't spoken to him, hadn't had any reason to remember him except for the quality of his attention toward Claire, that deliberate, patient focus that I had filed away and now retrieved. I tried to recall what I knew. Tall, mid-40s, expensive suit, a kind of settled confidence that spoke of old money or new money held long enough to feel old. I mentioned him to Claire casually one evening. We were cleaning up after dinner, Sophie already in bed, the kitchen quiet. "That man at the Reeves opening last month," I said. "The tall one. Do you know who he is?" Claire didn't look up from the sink. "There were a lot of people there. He was watching you most of the evening. Dark suit. Older." A half-second pause. Almost imperceptible. "I talk to a lot of collectors. I don't always remember names." She changed the subject smoothly. Asked whether I had remembered to call the plumber about the bathroom tap, and I let her redirect me. I noticed that I let her redirect me. I noticed and I stored it. I called Linda. This required calculation. Linda and Claire had been close since before I came into the picture. A friendship built on shared history and the particular loyalty that forms between women who have seen each other through difficult things. If Claire was confiding in anyone, it was Linda. And if Linda knew something, she would not volunteer it. But Linda had a tell. When she was uncomfortable, she laughed too quickly. I called her on a Wednesday afternoon, kept it casual. "How are you? How's work? How's that renovation?" And then lightly, Claire mentioned she's been out with you a few times lately. That new place on Harrington Street. Linda laughed. Too quickly. Oh, you know how it is, we end up wherever. She said last Thursday you were there until nearly midnight. Pause, that was just a beat too long. Did she? I thought we left earlier than that, honestly. Time flies. I said something neutral and ended the call. Linda had not been with Claire last Thursday. I drove past the Grand Meridian on a Friday afternoon. I don't know exactly what I expected to find. It wasn't a plan. More an impulse I followed without examining it too closely. The hotel was on the west side of the city, a boutique property that positioned itself as discreet and tasteful, the kind of place that charged enough to ensure a certain clientele. I sat in my car across the street for 10 minutes, watching people move through the entrance, and felt the particular hollowness of a man standing at the edge of something he can't unknow. A black SUV was parked in the small lot adjacent to the entrance. Late model, personalized plate. I memorized it without deciding to. That evening, I ran the plate through a contact I had at the city planning office, someone who owed me a professional favor. The vehicle was registered to a company called Aldren Capital Group. I searched the name. Marcus Aldren, 44, real estate investor. A profile in a business magazine from 2 years ago described him as one of the city's most active commercial property developers. The photograph showed a tall man with dark hair going silver at the temples and the composed expression of someone accustomed to getting what he pursued. I recognized him immediately. I sat with that recognition for a long time in the quiet of my home office, the house dark around me, Sophie asleep down the hall, Claire out at another gallery event. Somewhere in that hour, something inside me finished breaking. Not loudly, just completely. Claire's behavior shifted in the weeks that followed in ways that were simultaneously more obvious and more carefully managed. She had developed a new fluency with her cover stories. They came with more detail now, which I understood instinctively was a bad sign. Vague lies are confident lies. Detailed lies are constructed ones. She knew the name of the yoga instructor, the names of other women in the class, the specific streets the gallery events were held on. She had done her preparation. But the emotional tells were harder to control. She was irritable in a way she hadn't been before. A tight, compressed irritability that surfaced when I asked ordinary questions. Where are you going? When will you be back? How was your evening? Questions I had asked for 9 years without friction suddenly produced a slight tightening around her eyes. A fraction of a second where I could see her deciding how to answer. I recognized that fraction of a second. In my work, it was the moment before a structure revealed its weakness. I stopped asking the questions. Not because I had stopped needing answers, but because I needed her to stop knowing that I was looking. Ryan met me for a drink on a Thursday evening. I told him what I had found. The receipt, Linda's reaction, Marcus Aldren, the plate, the photograph. Ryan listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about him. When I finished, he looked at his glass for a moment. You need someone who does this professionally, he said. You're an engineer. You're going to build a structure out of circumstantial evidence and convince yourself it's load-bearing. He wasn't wrong. I know someone, he said. Former police. He's careful, he's discreet, and he doesn't give you more than the truth. I said I would think about it. I called the number Ryan gave me the following morning. Aaron Cole met me at a coffee shop on a Tuesday morning. He was in his mid-50s, compact and unhurried, with the particular stillness of someone who had spent years observing people without being observed in return. He ordered black coffee and listened to everything I said without writing anything down. When I finished, he asked 3 questions. How long had the behavior changes been occurring? Did I have any existing documentation, receipts, records, anything dated? Was I prepared for confirmation? That last question gave me pause. What do you mean, prepared? I said. Some people hire me hoping I'll find nothing, he said. It's worth knowing which kind of person you are before we start. I thought about Sophie's face over the whale poster, about the fraction of a second in Claire's eyes when I asked ordinary questions, about the receipt still sitting in the drawer of my desk at home. I'm the kind who needs to know, I said. Aaron nodded once and named his fee. The first week produced nothing definitive. Aaron was methodical in a way that matched my own temperament. He built a picture slowly, from publicly available information first. Marcus Aldren's social media presence was minimal but traceable. His company held properties across the city, including a penthouse apartment in the Aldren Tower development on the waterfront. He was recently divorced, no children. He moved in the circles that overlapped with the art world, gallery patrons, charity auction regulars, the kind of man whose name appeared on donor walls. Claire's gallery had hosted an Aldren Capital charity event 14 months ago. That was where they had met. 14 months ago. A full 2 months before I noticed any change in her behavior, which meant the early stages of whatever this was had been invisible to me entirely. I sat with that timeline and felt the particular coldness of understanding that I had been living inside a deception for over a year without recognizing it. The red herrings came in the second week. Aaron called me on a Wednesday to tell me that Claire had been seen at the hotel again, but not with Marcus Aldren. She had met a woman there for what appeared to be a long lunch. He had a photograph. Claire and a woman in her 40s I didn't recognize, sitting at a window table, talking with apparent ease. I felt something that I am not entirely proud of, a surge of something close to relief, followed immediately by the recognition that relief was premature and potentially manipulated. "Who is she?" I asked. "Working on it," Aaron said. The woman turned out to be Elena Marsh, the director of a gallery in the city's arts district, a legitimate professional contact. Their meeting was apparently about a collaborative exhibition. I had constructed a false confirmation and felt relief at its dismantling, which told me something uncomfortable about the state of my own objectivity. I was no longer processing this situation with engineering precision. I was processing it with the desperate logic of a man who still wanted to be wrong. I told myself to be more careful. Claire came home from a Thursday evening out and told me the gallery was considering her for a coordinator position. More hours, more responsibility, a title change. She was animated in a way she hadn't been with me in months, her eyes bright, talking about the exhibition calendar and the curator she would be working with. I watched her and thought, this is the version of her I fell in love with, this aliveness, this engagement. And then I thought, I don't know who put it there. I said the right things. Congratulations. You deserve it. Sophie will be proud. Claire looked at me for a moment with something that might have been guilt or might have been nothing, and then she kissed me on the cheek and went upstairs. I remained at the kitchen table until I heard the shower running. Aaron's confirmation came on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks into the investigation. He sent a secure file containing photographs and location data. Claire and Marcus Aldren at the Grand Meridian on 3 separate dates over the previous 6 weeks, entering together, departing together hours later. The timestamps were precise. The photographs were clear. There was also a photograph I hadn't expected. Claire and Marcus at a marina, standing beside a boat. A large one, white-hulled, the kind that cost more than most people's houses. Sophie had heard about the boat on the phone. Sophie had been telling me the truth in the uncomplicated way that children do. I closed the file. I sat in my car in the parking structure outside my office building for 40 minutes. Not thinking about anything in particular, just letting the confirmed weight of it settle into a shape I could eventually carry. Then I called James Hartwell. James Hartwell had handled our wills and the house purchase 7 years ago. A careful, precise man who I had always found reassuring in the way that competent professionals are reassuring. When I called him from the parking structure, he listened without interruption and then said, with the measured calm of someone who had navigated this particular terrain many times, "Come in Monday morning. Bring everything Aaron gave you. Don't confront her before we speak." I waited until Monday. Those 3 days were the strangest of the entire experience. Stranger, in some ways, than anything that came before or after. I moved through the house with the full knowledge of what I knew, watching Claire move through it in the full assumption that I didn't. I helped Sophie with homework and made dinner and watched television in the evenings and slept in the same bed as my wife. And the entire architecture of our shared life continued to stand around us even though I already knew it was coming down. There is something deeply disorienting about that, about inhabiting the surface of a life after its interior has already collapsed. James was thorough on Monday morning. He reviewed Aaron's file carefully, asked precise questions about the timeline, examined the receipt and the location data and the photographs with the neutral attention of someone assessing a document rather than a marriage. When he was done, he outlined my options with the quiet clarity that I had come to associate with people who are genuinely good at their work. He also said something that lodged itself firmly in my mind. The way you handle the next conversation will matter. Not legally, the evidence is sufficient regardless. But personally, for Sophie, for how you understand yourself afterward. I drove home and waited for Sophie to go to bed. Claire was in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She was making tea, her back to me, and for a moment I simply stood in the doorway and looked at her, at the familiar geometry of her shoulders, the way she held her mug with both hands, the particular quality of her stillness when she thought she was alone. I had loved this woman for 11 years. That fact existed simultaneously with everything else I knew, which was perhaps the most painful thing about the entire experience. Not that the love had vanished, but that it had nowhere left to go. I sat down at the kitchen table. "I need to talk to you." She turned. Something in my tone reached her before my words did. I saw it in the slight change of her expression, the way her hands tightened around the mug. "I know about Marcus Aldren," I said. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard in that kitchen. Claire set her mug down carefully. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "Daniel, I have photographs," I said. "Dates, times, locations. 3 separate occasions at the Grand Meridian. The Marina." I kept my voice even. "I'm not here to have an argument. I'm here because you deserve honesty and so do I." What followed was not a single conversation but several, layered and recursive, the way difficult conversations always are. Claire denied it first, reflexively, briefly, a denial that collapsed almost immediately under its own weight when I remained quiet and let the silence do the work. Then came minimization. It wasn't what it looked like. It had only happened a few times, it didn't mean anything significant. I said nothing. Then came the reframe, the version of the story that I had perhaps most dreaded, because it contained enough truth to be genuinely painful. She talked about the distance between us, about the years of feeling like a function in a well-organized household rather than a person being seen, about Sophie's birth and the drift afterward that neither of us had addressed, about feeling invisible in her own marriage. I listened to all of it. Some of it was true. I had been absent in the ways she described. Not cruelly, not intentionally, but absent nonetheless. I had confused the absence of conflict with the presence of connection. I had assumed that stability was the same thing as intimacy. These were real failures, and I did not defend them. "I understand some of what you're saying," I told her finally, "and I take responsibility for my part in the distance. But that's not what I'm sitting here for." I looked at her across the table. "You didn't tell me you were unhappy. You didn't ask for something different. You made a choice, and you made it repeatedly, and you kept it from me. That's what I can't move past." Claire began to cry. I watched her cry and felt the strange double grief of it, for her pain, and for the fact that her pain no longer had the power to change what I had already decided. She proposed couples therapy 3 days later. I had expected this, and I had thought carefully about how to respond. I told her I was willing to attend sessions, not because I believed it would change the outcome, but because I thought Sophie deserved parents who had made every reasonable effort before ending things. We sat across from a therapist twice, in a room with good light and careful furniture, and Claire spoke about the marriage with a raw honesty that I think surprised even her. I spoke about it too. Honestly, I think, for the first time in years. But by then I had already called James Hartwell again. And somewhere in the weeks between finding the receipt and sitting in that therapy room, the decision had settled into a certainty as quiet and immovable as anything I had ever calculated. The structure had failed. The only responsible thing left to do was understand why, clear the damage carefully, and build something that would hold. The divorce took 7 months. James Hartwell was exactly as careful and precise as I had expected him to be, and the process, while painful in the way that all dismantlings are painful, was managed with a minimum of unnecessary damage. Claire did not contest the primary custody arrangement. Sophie would live with me during the week, with Claire on weekends and extended holidays. We agreed on this without courtroom argument, which was perhaps the last genuinely collaborative thing we did as a couple. Claire moved into an apartment across the city in the spring. I don't know if she continued seeing Marcus Aldren. I didn't ask, and she didn't tell me, and I eventually reached a place where the answer genuinely didn't matter to me anymore. That arrival, at not needing to know, took longer than I expected and felt more like healing than anything else in the process. Ryan helped me repaint Sophie's room that summer. She had decided she wanted it yellow, a specific yellow she had identified in a picture book, which she described to us with great seriousness as the color of a good morning. We spent a Saturday getting it wrong twice before she approved the third attempt, supervising from the doorway with her arms crossed and the particular authority of a 7-year-old who knows exactly what she wants. Watching her face when we finally got it right, that open, uncomplicated satisfaction, I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for a very long time. I understood in that moment that the life I was building now was not a lesser version of the one that had ended. It was simply a different one, constructed from different materials with a clearer understanding of what I actually needed it to hold. There are things I know now that I didn't know then. I know that I mistook emotional stability for emotional connection, that the absence of visible conflict felt like evidence of a working marriage, when in fact it was evidence of two people who had stopped telling each other the truth. I had been so careful about keeping the surface of things smooth that I had stopped paying attention to what was happening beneath it. I know that the signs were present earlier than I wanted to admit. Not just the phone and the perfume and the late nights, but years before that, in the gradual narrowing of what Claire and I shared, the conversations that stayed on the surface, the assumption that our history together was a substitute for our present attention to each other. And I know this is the part that took longest to understand. That knowledge without the courage to act on it is its own kind of failure. I saw the receipt and I put it in my pocket. I heard my daughter mention a tall man twice and I filed it away. I let Claire redirect conversations that I should have held still. At every point where clarity was available to me, I chose the construction that required less of me. Even now, when I think back to that Tuesday evening, the coat, the receipt, the way the paper felt between my fingers, I feel the particular discomfort of a man who understood, in some part of himself, exactly what he was holding, and chose for a while not to look at it directly. Sophie has a fish now. She named it architecture, after my profession, which Ryan found so funny he nearly fell off his chair when she announced it. The fish lives in a small tank on her windowsill, in the yellow room, and Sophie checks on it with a seriousness that I find quietly moving every single time. On a Tuesday evening in late spring, I sat on the edge of her bed after lights out, listening to her breathing slow and deepen as she fell asleep. The room was warm. The fish moved in its lit tank. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into its nighttime quiet. I thought about the man I had been a year ago, careful and methodical and entirely certain that the life he had built was sound. I thought about what it had cost me to discover otherwise, and what it had given me in return. A clarity I had not previously possessed, a relationship with my daughter unmediated by the performance of a marriage that had already ended, and a slowly growing understanding of what it actually means to pay attention to the people you love. Not the surface, not the absence of conflict, the actual interior of the thing, with all its difficulty and demand. That is the lesson I paid the highest price for. That is the one I intend to keep. What this story ultimately reveals is how self-deception operates not as a single dramatic choice, but as an accumulation of small, seemingly reasonable ones. Daniel didn't ignore the truth because he was naive or weak. He ignored it because each individual signal taken in isolation could be rationalized. A receipt, a child's remark, a friend's uncomfortable laugh. None of these alone constituted proof. And so he built, piece by piece, a structure of alternative explanations that required less courage than the truth. Claire's behavior followed its own internal logic, the logic of someone who had stopped asking for what she needed and began, instead, taking it elsewhere. The emotional distance in their marriage was real, but the response to that distance, concealment, parallel living, the patient construction of a second life, foreclosed any possibility of repair. You cannot fix what you refuse to name. And what Claire refused to name, she eventually made irreversible. The point of no return wasn't the hotel receipt. It wasn't even the photographs Aaron delivered. It was the moment, somewhere in those years of drift after Sophie's birth, when both of them silently agreed to stop telling each other the truth about how they felt. Everything that followed was consequence. What Daniel carries forward is not bitterness. It is the more durable knowledge that love is not a structure that maintains itself. It requires the same deliberate attention as anything built to last, and the willingness to name its fractures before they become failures. What stays with me about this story isn't the betrayal itself. It's the silence that made it possible. Two people who once chose each other, gradually choosing instead to look away from everything that was quietly coming apart. And maybe that's the part that resonates most, because most of us have stood at some version of that moment, holding something we already understand, deciding whether to look at it directly. The receipt was just paper. What it asked of Daniel was something much harder than certainty. It asked him to stop being comfortable. Would you have looked sooner? Or would you have folded it too, and put it quietly away?